please welcome Dr. Arben Fox.
Thank you, everybody. It is a pleasure to be back speaking to the League of Women Voters. Obviously, this time we're doing it virtually. We'll see how well this works out. I've done a few of these virtual presentations over the past months. I've already done at least one since the election, and that one went okay, and I'm certain that, you know, given the preparation that everybody involved has put into this, that this one will be able to work out very well also. So I am going to make a couple of general comments where I try to give an overview of where things stand in terms of Kansas state politics and national politics. Maybe I'll start with the national political scene and I'll work down to the state level. But then I want to open it up to questions from you all. The audience for the League of Women Voters has always been a very educated and engaged audience, so I have no doubt you'll all have a lot of questions, and I look forward to having those filtered to me, and we'll see where things go from there. So first of all, as far as the national scene is concerned, when I gave a presentation on the election, like I mentioned, I did one not long after the election, a little discussion like this with another local organization here in Wichita. When I was speaking to them, they asked me, well, do you think that Joe Biden is going to become president? And I said, oh, I'm quite confident. I will give him a solid 85% chance of becoming president. Just very, very good odds. Now, that, of course, is said at least partly tongue-in-cheek, because the whole idea is we've had the election. We are aware of what the votes were. And even though there may be different states where there are recounts taking place and there are lawsuits being filed, there was no real serious sense that anything had gone wrong in the counting of those votes. And consequently, that means we know who the president is. And so for me to say, oh, I think there's a really good chance, an 85% chance that Joe Biden will be president come January 20th, I was purposefully pushing at the fact that we are in an unprecedented situation. And that unprecedented situation has been our existence since, you know, late election night till now, and it will probably continue to be our existence up until January 20th, when Joe Biden is sworn in as the next president. And that unprecedented situation is that we have a president who is refusing to concede. Now, if you really want to bend all the way over backwards and give President Trump and the supporters of President Trump as much credit as you can possibly imagine giving them, then you can probably go back through history and you can find some vaguely analogous situations. You had Al Gore, who conceded the election and then withdrew his concession and insisted that we've got to wait until all of these recounts and the legal fights over these recounts take place. You have some other events from history that, arguably kind of parallel what's happening here. But honestly, all of that stuff is a tremendous stretch. Fundamentally, we have never had in all of American history a situation, or at least not in the post-Civil War history of the American nation. We have not had an example of a president of the United States who 1 month after the election, in the face of across the board legal denials of all sorts of lawsuits and complaints that have been filed on his behalf, still insists that he actually won the election, still insists that the election was rigged, still insists that there are votes that are uncounted or votes that were counted unfairly and that you can't trust what these states are saying. We have just never had a situation like this. And so, in the face of that unprecedented political reality, while I am willing at this point to go up beyond my previously stated 85%, I'm willing to go all the way to like, 95% chance that Joe Biden will be president on January 20th, 2021. I'm not willing to go all the way to 100%. I don't think any of us should be. When you have a genuinely unprecedented situation, then that means, by definition, you don't know how it's going to end. You don't know what the results will be. You don't know what counts as a result. What are we going to make of a president of the United States who, at the present time, I think this is the most likely outcome. A president of the United States who will resign from the office a day or so before before the inauguration, and gets Vice President Pence, who then becomes President of the United States, to issue a blanket pardon for any criminal actions that might be brought against Donald Trump, and then leaves the White House, and leaves the White House saying to everyone who will listen, I only resigned the presidency in order to make certain that I'm given the legal protection to allow me to continue to fight on behalf of all of the voters out there who had their votes robbed by this rigged system that put Joe Biden in office. In other words, someone who leaves the White House completely denying the legitimacy of the person who has come to replace him, and insisting that in every substantive sense, he's still president of the United States. We don't know how that's going to end. We don't know what its ending would even mean. Am I perfectly comfortable now? No, I'm a lot more comfortable than I was in the days following the election. After all of the lawsuits that have been shot down by the courts, by the pretty broad sensibility amongst legal experts that even this new conservative majority, I mean, it's not new, there's been a conservative majority for a while, but this even stronger conservative majority on the Supreme Court, even they probably are not going to go with Trump. They're probably going to agree with the decisions that have come from the appellate courts and the state district courts. They're probably going to say this is just non-justiciable. We're not going to get into this. Go away. We could be wrong about that, because obviously over the last 4 years, we've been wrong about a great many things. But right now, a lot of legal experts and people that I trust think that not even the Supreme Court is going to save Donald Trump now. So that means, yeah, I'm feeling pretty confident that Joe Biden will be president. Am I perfectly confident? No, because again, this is unprecedented. We've never had this before. We've never, or at least not since the end of the Civil War. I mean, let me allow for some of the elections in the early 1800s with John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren. There was some really squirrely stuff that happened back then. But certainly in the last 160 years, we've never had a situation where somebody leaves the White House and says, oh, well, I'm actually president. We don't know what's going to follow from that. So that's scary. That's the national situation. Of course, the national situation isn't just the executive branch, it's also Congress. But you all know what the results were. The fact of the matter is that Republican voters turned out much, much more strongly than a lot of people were anticipating. And that Republican vote grew in some ways that surprised, even shocked a few people. It did not grow in numbers comparable to the way the Democratic numbers grew. The Democratic numbers grew all the way across the board, highest levels of turnout that the United States of America has seen in a national election in 100 years. And yeah, that is the reason why Joe Biden is going to be, or 95% chance that he's going to be president of the United States. But that's also the reason why, despite that huge Democratic turnout, that large Republican turnout managed to hold on to the Senate. It managed to whittle down Democratic control of the House of Representatives. I'm not worried that the House of Representatives is close enough that Nancy Pelosi is not going to be able to effectively get Democratic priorities through the House. I don't think we really need to worry about that. But I think that Mitch McConnell is probably going to end up with the same power in his hands when it comes to pushing Republican priorities through the Senate. Obviously, we're still waiting to see what happens in Georgia with the 2 runoff elections. Myself, I am not confident at all that both of them will break to the Democrats. I am not particularly confident that even one of them will break to the Democrats. I'm not as emphatic on that because I actually think the Warnock-Perdue race, might turn out in the Democrats' favor. But I mean, I certainly would not count on both. At most, maybe you could count on one, if you even want to do that, and maybe you don't even want to do that. Either way, whether it's 48 Democrats or 49 Democrats, it's not going to be a tie, and therefore you're not going to see Vice President Kamala Harris coming out and pushing things over for the Biden administration. You might see it occasionally. There might be some cases where Susan Collins in Maine or Lisa Murkowski in Alaska or Mitt Romney in Utah breaks with the Republican Party, and all of a sudden there's a possibility of getting something through. And obviously Joe Biden is a conventional enough politician that he's going to be thinking in those terms. But by and large, I don't think you can count on it. So nationally, we know what's going on. It's very, very, very likely Joe Biden will be president. And as president, he's going to be able to undo a lot of the things that Donald Trump did. And he's going to be able to push for a lot of things under his power as the chief executive. And then there's going to be a divided Congress with a Democratic-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate, a strongly conservative Supreme Court, and that's what we have on the national scene. So how about on the local scene, or rather on the state scene? On the state scene, well, there was a Republican wave, as I just mentioned. There was a Democratic wave too, but in places where there are more Republicans than Democrats, a Republican wave is going to make more of a difference than a Democratic wave. And that's what you had in Kansas. You had a lot of Democrats turning out, but you also had a lot of Republicans turning out. And there are a lot more Republicans in Kansas than there are Democrats. Consequently, things are looking even worse for Governor Laura Kelly in Topeka than they were before. Not radically worse. The greatest thing that the state Democratic Party was hoping for was to secure enough seats in the Kansas State House and the Kansas State Senate to prevent the Republican majority from being able to overturn a veto. Okay? They need a supermajority in order to overturn a veto, and we didn't prevent them from holding on to that supermajority. So the fact of the matter is that Governor Kelly is not going to be able to govern this state through veto. That was the hopes for a fair number of Democrats, that, when we have a Democratic governor, we don't have to have a majority in the state house or the state senate. Ideally, we would like to, but we don't have to. All we need to have is enough support for Governor Kelly in the State House and the State Senate, so that when stuff gets passed and she vetoes it, that veto can't be overturned. And in that way, the governor has leverage to try to force compromises and peel off different Republicans and try to join with the Democrats in order to move things forward. That's not going to be an option for Governor Kelly. If the Republicans hold together and they want to ram things through over Governor Kelly's veto, they do in fact have the votes to do so. So that takes one of the tools away, one of the tools that Governor Kelly might have been able to make use of away from her. Looking forward in the state of Kansas, I find that I am thinking a lot about the party situation in Kansas. I am not an expert on political parties, on their funding or their internal organization, but I mean, I study politics for a living and I know a fair amount about parties and I have opinions about parties. A lot of people hate parties. They think that they are by definition corrupt. They think that they close off the free exchange of ideas, that they force people to act in particular ways, that they narrow the range of acceptable views. They just don't like them, okay? I disagree with almost all of that. I think political parties, while obviously a problem for people that are concerned about good government, a problem for people that are always on the lookout for corruption and organizational interests that are going to privilege certain special groups over other groups. I mean, of course, you have to look out for those things. But you would have to look out for those things no matter what type of bodies emerge in a free society where people have the right to assemble and the people have the right to express themselves. Given that we live in such a free society, I actually don't think political parties are that bad of an instrument for making mass democracy work. And I want to see functioning political parties that can do the kind of things that they are designed to do, that can provide real accountability to voters by delivering candidates to the voters that they can trust and allowing those voters to punish candidates that they don't like anymore and replacing them with other candidates. I want to see parties that are really responsive to the input of people. One of the struggles that I think Kansas is facing is that for many years, Kansas had a kind of a party arrangement that worked. That party arrangement was you had the Democrats and then you had the Republicans. But within the Republican Party, you had the conservative Republican faction and you had the moderate Republican faction. So essentially, you had a three-party system in Kansas. And there were all sorts of different ways in which those different factions could align with each other or pick fights with one another. And through that kind of accepted reality, practical people that wanted to govern the state properly could figure out how to get things passed in the state legislature and get things signed by the governor and get laws implemented and get laws changed when they needed to change. That system has broken down. Now, I've recently read through a collection of columns by Ed Flintjay, longtime professor at Wichita State University. A lot of you may remember that for about 10 years, he was a regular columnist in the Wichita Eagle. This is a nice book that was put together that has all of these, well, not all of these, but an awful lot of these essays collected together, along with some cartoons from Richard Crowson. You should all go to Watermark Books and buy it. Reading through these, I see in the writings of Ed Flintjay, and I also see this in the comments of a lot of other political experts, a mourning for the breakdown of this system. and also an expression of confidence, an expression of hope that, Kansas voters, they get captivated by different ideas. They'll run really hard in a conservative direction, but eventually that stampede will end and they'll back off from that, and the old system will come back into play. And that's how Ed Flenche kind of finished off his run of columns. He stopped writing them in 2019. He was able to look back on the election of Laura Kelly in 2018. He was able to look at the midterm elections halfway through Sam Brownback's second term back in 2016. And he says, yeah, see, this is the system. This is the three-party system recovering, bringing itself back. If you take a look at the results of the election of 2020, what you see is not only strong Republican majorities in the state House and the state Senate, but you also see strong Republican majorities that are more conservative than in the past. And this is because party polarization has taken place not just everywhere in the country, but within Kansas. Barbara Bollier is a great example. Barbara Bollier, longtime moderate conservative. She's elected to the state legislature from Mission Hills there in the Kansas City area. All of these people were very, very comfortable with having this person who was fiscally quite moderate in some social ways, was somewhat liberal. They were very comfortable with her within the Republican Party. But then the Republican Party changes under Sam Brownback, and she finds it intolerable. And she realizes, I've got to become a Democrat. And the Democratic voters are there. At least they're there in Mission Hills, and they're there in other places in Johnson County. And, there's quite a few here in Central County as well. You can find them all across Kansas, mostly in big cities and mostly completely outnumbered by all of the Republicans in the suburbs and the exurbs, to say nothing of the Republicans in rural areas. So you have this polarization, and the polarization is increasing the ideological distance between the parties. So while it's wrong to read too much into any one election, I take a look at where the state legislature stands now. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not sure it's really a whole lot different from the state legislature that Sam Brownback built from 2010 through 2014. And to be honest, you can take a look at state Republican parties across the country, and you can see something similar that has taken place. For that matter, you can take a look at the National Republican Party. You could take a look at the fact that Donald Trump won the nomination of the National Republican Party, and that the Republicans supported him strongly, and that the Republicans continued to support him strongly in the 2020 elections, as well as further down ballot. I am thinking that maybe we have really seen over the last 10 years, between Brownback, between Trump, between a lot of other things that have taken place in America, I'm wondering if we have just seen a severe enough shock to the way political parties traditionally operated, that the kind of baselines, the kind of norms that people got used to, both here in Kansas and elsewhere, and developed theories about how to effectively govern in the face of that particular baseline. I'm just wondering if a lot of that has been thrown out the window, or if it's not been thrown out the window, it's really, really been pushed back. It's possible that the old baseline will still return. It's possible that 2 years from now, Donald Trump's not on the ballot. It's a midterm election. Laura Kelly will be running for re-election, and you'll see the kind of electorate, the kind of voter turnout that Laura Kelly was able to put together in 2018, coming back again in 2022. I mean, that's entirely possible. But I'm just thinking, especially after reading all of these essays with, you know, the sense of history about how things worked, and the frustration with the way it was changed during the Brownback years, and the confidence that, well, of course, you know, we're going to get back to the way it was supposed to be. And then you take a look at the results of the 2020 elections and you think, is it really? Is it really going to spring back to exactly what it was before? Maybe things are different now. Maybe Brownback, maybe Trump fundamentally changed some things about the Republican Party. And that's going to change things about the Democratic Party. It's going to make the Democratic Party much, much more popular in suburbs. It's already much more popular in cities. It's going to make it more popular in suburbs. And then that means that maybe it's going to be even less popular in, you know, exurban and rural communities. It's hard to imagine, you know, the first district in Kansas becoming even more Republican, but maybe it is. Maybe the urban-rural divide is becoming such a stark Democratic-Republican divide that the sort of baselines, the sort of ways in which parties were made to effectively do their jobs just isn't going to be the case anymore. There's a whole lot of different ways in which you could dig into this. You could say, oh, it's not Brownback and Trump, it's Twitter, it's social media, it's, you know, it's the way our information ecosystem has changed the way we respond to the news and the way we identify ourselves. I mean, that's a pretty good argument. You could argue that it's economics. You know, we had the crash on Wall Street and the Great Recession, beginning all the way back in 2007 and 2008. And arguably, we've never really entirely recovered from that. And, you know, the pandemic and COVID certainly hasn't helped. So, you know, so maybe there's an economic explanation. There could be a lot of other things we could add to this. But I'm going to kind of wrap it up right here and turn to the questions. And I just want to say that the situation that we have right now nationally may look like it is, you know, finally settling to something normal, but I'm not willing to go all the way to say it's normal, because we're faced with, you know, something that is truly unprecedented on the national level. And on the state level, we're looking at something that suggests, to me at least, that maybe we have to rethink how it is that political parties have served the voters of Kansas, because maybe we're just not going to go back to the way things were, you know, when Kathleen Sebelius was governor, or for that matter, Graves or other earlier governors before her. Okay, so there's some thoughts, there's some big picture stuff. We can chew on that, or you can really ask questions about pretty much anything else. So Megan, were you going to read those to me then?
Yes. So far we've had, okay, we have just taken it for granted that the president would be who we voted for as compared to who the Electoral College elects. And so this is referring back to what you were talking earlier. So isn't it always true that we've had an uncertainty due to the Electoral College?
Well, functionally, sure. You know, ever since the rise of mass democracy, and by the time you get to the Civil War, by the time you get to the decades following the Civil War, all of the states of the Union are allowing people to popularly vote to president. All of the states of the Union have laws on their books instructing electors to go along with the popular vote. There's been, you know, arguments about those and changes in those, but, you know, basically we're, you know, probably 160 years, 150 years into mass democracy here. And in the midst of that, there's always been the Electoral College. And so, yes, there's always been some kind of uncertainty. What if when the electors gather on December 14th, they actually vote for somebody besides who the people have voted for. There have always been what are called faithless electors. Electors, because electors are overwhelmingly chosen by the political parties within the states, and then the state legislatures say, okay, these people that have been nominated by the parties, we are appointing you as our electors. Go vote for our state. There's always been some that buck the system, that, even though they're Democratic appointees, they don't vote for the Democratic candidate. Or even though they're Republican appointees, they don't vote for the Republican candidate. There has never, in all of the elections, ever since the popular vote started being counted, there's never been enough dissent in the Electoral College vote for it to make a difference. You've got, like the 2016 election, the last time the electors got together and voted, okay? There were faithless electors. Most of those faithless electors were not on Trump's side. They were on Clinton's side, like Washington State. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in Washington State, so the Democratic Party got to appoint the electors. The state legislature in Washington State said, okay, you guys are our electors, go vote for us. And 3 of them didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. 3 of them voted for like a Native American Indian chief as a protest, But oh, sorry. It all of a sudden seemed like it was I was being muted there. Sorry about that. Anyway, so yes, obviously that uncertainty has always functionally been there, but it's never really been, an issue that anybody has taken entirely seriously. I guess now you've got people taking it seriously. Do we know for a fact that these states are going to certify Democratic appointees who are going to go and cast their Electoral College votes for Joe Biden? I think we have a pretty strong reason to believe that that will in fact be the case, but obviously we don't know it. And that's one of the problems with having the Electoral College. It adds an additional layer of ambiguity to this process. For most of my life, I'm sure for most of all of your lives, you didn't ever think about that ambiguity, because why? That's not the way the system works. Now all of a sudden we're thinking, well, maybe we don't know how the system works. Look, don't freak out. I think there's like a 95% chance Joe Biden's going to be president on January 20th. I think it's very, 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 very likely. I'm not willing to say there's nothing else that could go wrong, because a lot has already.
That goes into the next question on what are your thoughts regarding the elimination of the Electoral College and going with the popular vote only?
Oh, I'm strongly in favor of it. The only way we could get there is through a constitutional amendment, because the Constitution specifically says that the President of the United States is chosen by the Electoral College. There are workarounds out there that could get us pretty close to it without a constitutional amendment. I'm kind of dubious about this National Popular Vote Compact, because thus far the National Popular Vote Compact, for those of you who don't know what it is, the National Popular Vote Compact, it's an initiative that came out of the state of California, and basically it's this idea that state governments will commit through state law, through the writing of state law, to give their electoral college votes to the person who wins the national popular majority. Okay? So if you've got this compact functioning in your state, that means that when it comes time for the state legislature to appoint electors, you're not going to go to the party that represents who won the majority within your state. You're going to go to the party that represents the winner of the national popular vote. Okay. So, this came out of California, and you have quite a few states that have signed on to it. The thing is that all of the states that have signed on to it are blue states. They're strongly Democratic states. Okay. The compact can't make any difference until you actually have states like Kansas agreeing to the national popular vote compact. So I'm kind of dubious about that. I think a more productive workaround might be if every single state does what Nebraska does and does what Maine does. So state law in Nebraska and Maine calls for the state legislature to have parties nominate electors who would be appointed to cast electoral college votes, not based on who won the majority statewide, but who won the majority within individual congressional districts. So, for example, in Nebraska, Nebraska is really not that much different politically from Kansas, but it has this law that's different from the state of Kansas. So all 6 of Kansas's electoral college votes are going to go to Trump. However, all 5 of Nebraska's electoral college votes are not going to go to Donald Trump. 4 of them will go to Donald Trump. 1 of them are going to go to Joe Biden, because the congressional district where you find the city of Omaha actually had more votes for Joe Biden than Donald Trump. And so 1 of their electoral college votes are going in that direction. If every single state did that, that would not be the same as a national popular vote, but it would certainly be closer to it, and it would really change the way parties run presidential campaigns. But I mean, if it was an actual real live option to get rid of the electoral college and go to a national popular vote, I would do it in a heartbeat. People complain about how, that means that, presidential candidates will only focus on winning big population centers. Well, they already do. People say, that means small rural states will be ignored. They already are. I really don't think the stuff that defenders of the Electoral College complain about would actually make that much difference if the Electoral College disappeared.
Okay, and this question is from somebody who has attended at least one previous presentation that you had. They asked, Dr. Fox, please share your thoughts about Stuart Stevens' book, It Was All a Lie, How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump.
I still have not read that book. A lot of people have recommended it to me. The thesis of that book is, I think, one that, on the basis of some of the things I've said earlier, I'd find a lot of agreement with. Donald Trump has, to a great extent, remade the Republican Party. Not entirely. Somebody else I can see in the chat is wondering about moderates. I mean, obviously there are still moderates out there, but those moderates increasingly find themselves in a situation where one of the major parties has gone not so much necessarily in an ideologically conservative direction, though, I mean, it is very conservative ideologically speaking, but it's gone more in a direction that is deeply, fundamentally, stylistically oppositional. Donald Trump is someone who made his name as a media figure, as a business person. He made his name by marketing himself and his own very, very confrontational approach to dealing with other people. That filters through. That just kind of oozes through the whole system. And you find a political party that is increasingly interested in confrontation, that is increasingly interested not so much in governance as in trying to identify those positions that they feel are under attack, that are being treated with disrespect, and they're going to double down on those positions. You know, how on earth do you get opposition to mask wearing during the pandemic and uh, you know, ideological conservatism? And how do you get both of those things to overlap on the personality of Donald Trump? The one thing that unites them is a sense of grievance, a sense of trying to identify an enemy and push back against that. Scientists tell you to wear a mask. Well, you know, screw the scientists. I'm going to do my own thing. The media tells you that you know, Donald Trump has, you know, violated all of these different protocols and norms. You respond by saying, but those protocols and norms didn't matter anyway. I mean, I do not want to come off as saying that the Republican Party is just a personality cult now, because it's obviously not. I mean, there's a lot of Republicans that I know. There's a lot of Republicans that all of you know. There's probably any number of Republicans who are listening to me right now who have, you know, pretty consistent ideas about taxes, about abortion, about trade, about the role of the judiciary. I mean, you know, the conservative sensibility is still very much there. But can you act electorally on that conservative sensibility when the party vehicle has become very, very deeply infected by this addiction to grievance, to confrontation, to, you know, picking fights and stylizing yourself as already in a fight, you know, already in a fight against, you know, forces and powers and the deep state that is lurking out there somewhere. You know, I mean, we have got, you know, politicians, we've got longtime civil servants that are actually really very, very conventional people, and yet they're, if not explicitly signing on to this, they're not signing on to this. I mean, think about Senator Jerry Moran. Okay, Senator Jerry Moran is obviously a conservative. He's a principled conservative. He can articulate his conservative views in a very, very consistent way. And some people like the guy and some people don't like the guy, but I mean, he was just a conservative Republican, all right? And he's a conservative Republican who's built his career through this system. And now you have someone who is living in the White House, who has lost a presidential election, and Jerry Moran says nothing. You know, just like national Republican leaders all across the country, they're saying nothing, or they're explicitly saying, well, we don't know who the president is going to be until the electors vote. Well, okay, right. Technically, that's always been the case. It's also never been the way you've talked before. What is so different now? What's different now is that I fear the party system maybe has been affected in a fundamental way and turned it into something that it wasn't before.
Okay. The next question is, and if anybody else has a question, please submit it, and we'll fit in as many as we can. The next question is, what information do we have regarding voter registration? Was there a more significant uptick in new registrants than in past presidential elections?
Yes, more people were registered and more people turned out to vote. Voter registration and voter turnout went up, and that went up across the board. It went up for men and women. It went up for blacks, whites, Latinos, Asian Americans. I look forward to more specific election poll, exit poll data. I mean, some of that is coming out now, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I think that broadly speaking, we could say that the tremendous voter registration efforts and get out the vote efforts were a success. It's just that the success didn't necessarily result in the votes that a lot of the people, pushing those efforts thought they would. I mean, obviously, all through the 2020 election, you had this ongoing narrative. Democrats want more people to vote. The Republicans want fewer people to vote. Well, in the end, the Republicans were saved by the fact that there was a really huge Republican voter turnout to match the huge Democratic voter turnout. So yeah, numbers for both registrations and turnout were up across the board.
The next one is, can you give us a rundown on the Kansas House and Senate by party? And I'm guessing they mean in terms of influence.
Well, okay, so I mean, you've got in the Senate, you got 40 seats in the Senate, 29 Republicans, 11 Democrats. Got 125 seats in the House, 84 Republicans, 40 Democrats. I think I saw that Chris Rogers is in the meeting somewhere. She would probably actually have a better idea than I. I think she'd probably have a better idea than I who the likely movers and shakers are going to be. With Susan Weigel's disappearance, there is some talk that this large Republican majority is nonetheless going to be maybe somewhat easier for Governor Kelly to work with than was the case before. I am personally doubtful about that, but it is true that, Susan Weigel had a very, very clear agenda. She was clearly aiming to use the legislature to launch her bid for the Republican nomination for Senate. And she made specific choices in regards to Medicaid expansion, the abortion constitutional amendment, and other things because she wanted that. I'm not saying that she didn't believe in those things. I'm sure she does. But I also think that she organized her forces in order to promote herself in that way. Since we're not going to have that kind of, self-promoting person, or at least not, so it is not obvious that we're going to have that kind of self-promoting person. Maybe the leadership of the Republican Party in the Senate, and then also, to a lesser degree in the House, maybe they're going to make different sorts of decisions. Maybe those decisions will be ones that, Democrats within the state legislature will be able to work with somewhat better. Again, I'm doubtful. I don't think that Governor Kelly is going to have any more chances for getting Medicaid expansion through the legislature than she did during the first 2 years. I think the constitutional amendment trying to overturn the Hodes decision by the state Supreme Court in regards to abortion is very, very likely to get out of the legislature. I'm not convinced it'll pass when it is set to a vote, but I'm pretty convinced it's going to happen. Yeah, I'm afraid Governor Kelly is going to be run ragged over the next couple of years.
Okay, the next question is, in Kansas, what percentage of Republicans consider themselves moderate rather than conservative? And where have all the moderates gone?
It used to be that people would talk about how Kansas was divided into perfect thirds. 1/3 moderate Republican, 1/3 conservative Republican, 1/3 Democrat. That's not true anymore. Where have the moderate Republicans gone? On the one hand, they've become Democrats. I mean, that's Sharice Davids right there. Okay, Sharice Davids election to Congress from the 3rd Congressional District is, I mean, when you get down to taking a look at the voting results, taking a look at it precinct by precinct, it is very clear that there are Democratic voters where there used to be Republican voters. And these were the moderate Republicans that, you know, sent people like Barbara Bollier to the state legislature. So yeah, moderate Republicans have become Democrats. Moderate Republicans have also stopped being moderate. Maybe this is because, you know, they were just traditional party people. A lot of folks are, you know, a lot of folks are not nerds like all of us right here, right now. You know, they're not really interested in political information. They're not really interested in who's up and who's down in politics. They have things that they believe in, and they attach themselves to a party that is able to deliver that. As long as, you know, people like Barbara Bollier were able to make a place for themselves within the Kansas State Republican Party, these voters were fine voting Republican. And then Barbara Bollier has had enough, and she bolts and she becomes a Democrat. And a lot of other voters bolt and become Democrat. And then a lot of other voters, a lot of other moderate Republican voters are like, well, but I'm a Republican. So who do I vote for now? Well, this guy is kind of more conservative than I used to vote for, but am I really going to vote for a Democrat? Democrats kill babies. Democrats, you know, they're all Muslim terrorists. I can't vote for Democrats. So I'm going to vote for the more conservative Republican. And they do that. And then they do that the next election cycle. And they do that the next election cycle. And wow, now they are a conservative Republican. They may not identify themselves that way. They may still call themselves a moderate. But when you take a look at their voting record, yeah, they've become a conservative Republican. So where are the moderate Republicans? They're out there. They're trying to hold on to, you know, some sort of toehold within the Kansas Republican Party. Obviously, you know, things can change quickly. You know, in 2018, it was Republicans that elected, not just Sharice Davids, but elected Laura Kelly. And so those moderate Republicans could feel good about themselves. But now you take a look at who are the candidates that got sent to the state legislature, and you wonder, do they really have that much pull with the party at all? I'm not sure.
In what role do you think fear of change and fear of losing status has driven the radical right voters? They have a friend who fervently believes that Trump made it safe to be Christian again and protected us from dangerous immigrants by building the wall. Her support of him is driven by fear. So the role of fear.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Fear is probably even a better way to express what I was kind of alluding to before when I talked about how Trump's whole approach is one of antagonism, confrontation, picking fights. The idea is that there's a threat out there. And this threat is not a typical threat. It's a spookier threat. It's a more ambiguous threat. It's a threat that's built into the system. And that means that you've got to go outside the system. You've got to break the system if you're going to be able to respond to that threat. So, you know, historically, immigration means people start moving into your neighborhood that don't look like, or don't worship like, or don't talk like the people that used to be in your neighborhood. And sometimes that resulted in, you know, new cultural forms emerging as people work together. And sometimes that resulted in a lot of defensiveness. But that's the ordinary give and take of life within a neighborhood. But now maybe you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, it's not just these people moving into this neighborhood. It's bigger than that. It's deeper than that. It's worse than that. They're capturing the media. They're capturing the schools. They're not going to allow me to just live my own life within my neighborhood. They're going to come after me. I turn on the television and there's all these people that don't look like me and don't express their sexuality like me, looking back at me. I'm surrounded by this stuff. I've got to fight back in some way. It's a kind of fear. It's a different kind of fear because I will go to my deathbed convinced that overwhelmingly, the people who are expressing this fear are not feeling something that is arising from a neighbor or a coworker or someone they actually see in the flesh at the school or at their church or anywhere else. No, overwhelmingly, this fear is coming from stuff that's been shared on Twitter. It's coming from stuff that's been highlighted by Fox News. In other words, it's something that's been mediated and delivered to people. So that's a different kind of fear. And maybe it's reasonable that people who are experiencing this kind of fear feel like, how do I, protect my identity as a Christian? Oh, well, so do you go to church? Do you tithe? Do you, proselyte to your neighbors? Do you do the things that Christians do? No. In order to defend my life as a Christian, I've got to elect this person president of the United States. Well, that makes no sense. Unless, of course, you believe that the threat is some kind of deep state force that is working to undermine the Christian identity of the collective that you're part of. And you need Donald Trump to defend that. I mean, that's not the way, the human beings have historically thought about fear. So maybe this is a reason to go back to, what I was saying before, that, maybe social media is the explanation for everything. Maybe the parties aren't able to do the jobs that they used to do because now people are motivated by fears and threats that are mediated to them rather than fears and threats that you deal with by, living your life in your neighborhood the way historically people always have.
You think we can fit one more question in?
I mean, I can go after 1 o'clock if people want to. I have an appointment at 1:30, so we'll have to stop at some point, but I can go longer if people...
Okay, then we have 2 questions.
Okay.
It says from Linda, why don't we have a movement taking the issue of getting rid of the Electoral College to each of the states in order to change the Constitution? We keep hearing it would take a change in the Constitution, but no answer as to why no one is doing that.
People are doing it. You spend some time on Google. You can absolutely find different organizations that are trying to raise money and trying to promote awareness about convincing people that, the Electoral College is bad. I just got a book in the mail the other day from a retired professor from KU who, what am I going to do now in retirement? I'm going to write a book explaining everything that's wrong with the Electoral College and what to do about it. There's a lot of people who care about this, but those people aren't winning elections. Those people, for the most part, aren't running for election. Is getting rid of the Electoral College, I guess ask yourself this. I can ask myself this question. Is getting rid of the Electoral College the most important thing in my political life? Is it the thing that I really want to dedicate my time and my money and my energy to doing? Well, no, actually, there's a lot of other stuff that I think is more important. I'm actually really interested in what's going on in the Wichita City Council right now. Is the Electoral College terrible? Yes. Will I tell people it's terrible? Yes. Would I financially support a actually plausible effort to get rejection of the Electoral College on state ballots all across the country? I absolutely would do that. Am I personally going to take the time to start traveling to Topeka and finding the votes to get action against the Electoral College on the ballot? No, actually, I'm not going to do that. So there's a lot of good causes out there. Getting rid of the Electoral College is one of them. Pick your cause, I guess.
If you open up the Electoral College, would it only be on that issue, or would it be opening up the Constitution for many changes?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. I mean, if you have an actual constitutional amendment that is removing the Electoral College, then you're not opening anything else up.
Okay.
But if you call a new constitutional convention, which some people like to talk about, I mean, the Constitution provides for how you could call for a new convention. And there's quite a few states that have voted for calling a new convention. Not the necessary number, but quite a few states have, mostly because you get these occasional marginal groups that, you know, want to have a new constitutional convention because they want to impose a flat tax in the place of an income tax or something like that. But yeah, I mean, so the votes out there exist for that. And if there was a constitutional convention, well then yeah, everything would be opened up. But just an amendment to the Constitution, no, that wouldn't need to change anything except no more Electoral College.
Okay, and then have you seen any data on how much the pandemic had to do with Biden's win? Would he have won had we not been in the midst of this pandemic and the way the Trump administration reacted to the pandemic?
It's really hard to find reliable data on something like that because it's a massive counterfactual. I mean, basically what you have to do is you either have to go all the way back to February and extrapolate from trends at that time. And that's almost impossible because all the way back in February, you know, you still had Bernie Sanders in the race. You still had Elizabeth Warren in the race. It's very, very difficult to determine what would have happened in November on the basis of polls from February and early March. Or if you don't want to do that, you somehow take a look at the polling and figure out how you can, on the basis of responses to pandemic specific questions, how you could kind of factor out the pandemic from the political responses that people were giving in those same polls. That would be a very, very complicated thing to do. And I wouldn't have a whole lot of trust in it on, you know, myself. So if the question is, have I seen any data on, you know, how much the pandemic affected Biden's win? I've seen a lot of speculation. I've seen a lot of argument. Some of those arguments make some really good persuasive points. But have I seen data? No. And I don't think that you can trust any data that would say that. Personally, do I think Biden would have won if there hadn't been the pandemic? Yeah, actually, I do think he would have. What would have been the down ballot results if there hadn't been a pandemic? That I can't tell you. In some ways, the pandemic served the interests of get out the vote efforts. Everybody was thinking that the pandemic was going to suppress voter turnout. But because the pandemic became so politicized, mask or anti-mask, that really kind of pushed those get out the vote efforts even further. So, I mean, it's really kind of bizarre. I've already seen some speculation that if we had the exact same get out the voter efforts in 2024 and there's no pandemic, we would actually see lower vote results than we saw this way. Was that a pandemic issue? Maybe that's just a Trump issue. I don't know. But in some ways, this voter turnout this year might be a black swan, just might be a unicorn, a rare event.
Okay, then I have one question. President Trump is not the first person to question election results. Jill Stein formally asked for recounts in the last presidential election. Beth Clarkson has tried locally and was obviously blocked. Even though she was very qualified. She could have been hired to conduct a thorough independent audit. That the audits have been very difficult to get, post-election audits incorporated not just within Kansas but across the nation. So what should the public be able to question a vote, and in what circumstances should that be allowed or not allowed?
I mean, I don't have a strong opinion on this. I tend to default in the direction of allowing, audits and recounts and other actions to go forward. I tend to default in the direction of transparency. I recognize that attitude opens the door for, sometimes malicious actors. I mean, obviously, some of Donald Trump's legal arguments, are taking advantage of just really, really bizarre loopholes. Remember, some of you in the week immediately following the election, maybe it was in the 2 weeks immediately following the election, one of the issues in Pennsylvania was that the state government had laid down rules that they thought were going to be pandemic safe, social distancing rules when it comes to the canvassing of votes. And one of those rules kept election observers a certain distance away. And they fought that. It was a ridiculous thing to fight, but I think the government in Pennsylvania made the right decision to cave on that and say, yeah, fine. Okay, yes, it's probably a pandemic risk, but go ahead, come within 6 feet of the table. Feel free to lean over and grab the ballots as they're being canvassed. I can see a downside to all of that, but generally speaking, I'm going to be on the side of transparency, and I'm going to be on the side of allowing even fairly wingnut complaints, fairly out there demands to go forward when it comes to the counting of votes and the recounting of votes and the canvassing of votes, and the challenging of those canvasses as well.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, for coming and presenting, and it's always valuable insight.
Well, thank you, Megan, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone else, for setting this up. I really appreciate the opportunity to, respond to questions and just talk about this stuff with informed people like you all. So have a wonderful day, everybody.